Okay, thank you very much. Right. So, writing in agile and development environment. Brief aside right at the very beginning, because I'll probably wander off several times anyway. Last year at conference, I presented on a totally different topic, and it was great, and I enjoyed it, and it scared me rigid and all those kind of things, so I thought I'd do it again. But outside of the sessions, I spent a lot of time having discussions with people about writing in agile development environments. And I felt that I was sort of on one side of the fence and everybody else was on the other one, and they were saying, it's never going to work for me, and it can't possibly happen, and it's not going to work, and it blah, 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 blah. I was thinking, well, that's not my experience. So I thought, come in and speak to you again this year, and I have to admit, from the discussions I've had so far with people, it seems like it's becoming much more accepted, and people realise that you can write in an agile development environment. So that's how this came about, basically. A little bit of information about me, just in case you're really interested. I've been a technical writer now for over 25 years, which actually means I've been writing for half of my life. Great. Worked in a range of industries, from servo hydraulic test systems for Formula One race teams to cellular mobile telephones, blah, blah, blah. I've been working at McAfee, which is now Intel Security, for over 12 years now. It's coming up to 13 at the end of this year. So for the last half of my writing experience pretty much now has been based on internet security in some form or another. About 2.5 years ago, I first came across the term agile and etc. And initially, I was very scared about whether it was possible, whether you could write in an agile environment, all the things that I'm sure you will fully understand if you do write in agile, or will understand if you don't yet. Okay, and at the moment, I have varying levels of engagement with 5 different agile teams within the group. Okay, all right, so some information from you. So what kind of things are you hoping to get from this presentation? So if we start off with a show of hands, who currently uses agile or sits on agile teams or whatever? So oops, about 2/3 of the room, that's quite good. Does everybody work across multiple teams, or are these not quite so many, but so probably half of the people using agile are with a single team, the other half are with multiple teams. Okay, that's fine. And people that think they may well be writing in an agile environment very soon. So, yep, there's a few of those as well. So, okay, that's a good collection. So you never know, I might be asking some of you for some of your views as well. Okay, so what is agile? First bit's fairly boring, but couple of people, the agilemanifesto.org and agilemethodology.org have these to say. I'm not going to read it all. The top one is probably the most interesting, and the highlighting is mine. They value interactions and individuals over processes and tools. So if you have a problem, don't rely on process or your tools necessarily. Go and talk to the person. So great. There's this concept of working software. Get it working rather than necessarily spending 6 months documenting how you want it to work. Just do it. I think we've heard before at this conference. Customer collaboration rather than contract negotiation. That one I take as being, let's actually ask customers what they want from a product and then see what we can do to give them that, rather than spend hours, weeks, days, months negotiating with what we will allow them to have. So it's change of focus and responding to change, and that's something I'll be talking a little later, over following a plan that you've set up for years ahead. Right, how my teams run agile. I mean, I'm sure we all have an idea of the agile theory, but one thing that I very quickly found is that agile is something that is different everywhere it's used. Agile basically runs with a number of small multidisciplinary teams. They run a number of sprints of short duration, each focused on stories. Flash word for this is what we're going to do. It goes on, and the team itself includes the design and development, the QA people, the writers, other sort of core people, and then you tend to get stakeholders that have an interest but perhaps aren't actually doing the day-to-day work of development. The theory says, note the stress on the word theory, says that the output of each sprint is a potentially shippable increment. Which, other words, means that in theory, at the end of each sprint, you could actually give something to a customer if you wanted. A couple of little caveats, which we'll come to later, but that's the theory. Now, what have I found? Every agile team is different. Yeah, interesting. As I said, I'm currently working on 5 teams, have different levels of engagement. Some of them are, one of them is probably 65-70% of my work. One of them is maybe once every 1 or 2 months, they'll come to me and they'll say, look, we need a little bit of your input, and it'll be a couple of hours work in that particular sprint. Just depends how things go. Team size, I think the theory says 7 or under. My main product team is about 20 strong, but we work in a sort of fluid number of smaller teams. I say fluid because they're perhaps not strictly agile. They will stick to their sprint lengths, but they will tend to pull in resources into a team for duration to be able to meet that. So it's a slight spin. My experience is, from a writer's view, you're better off working in sprint with your team. I've heard all sorts of comments previously about writers have to work a sprint after the other team, or, oh, actually, we'll write waterfall and let them do agile underneath. Working in sprint, is it pressured? Yep. You have a lot of pressure. You have to finish everything at the time that everybody else finishes everything. It's a short period of time. One thing that all my teams did is when we first started going agile, we stuck to the sprint should be 2 weeks long and the regression hardening sprint should be 3 weeks long. And very quickly, one by one, each team said, this isn't working for us. We can't fit the amount of work into this. So what started happening was a story would not quite be completed at the end of sprint. So it would have to be rolled over to the next sprint, where it would get completed, but that then meant that they didn't start on the next story till halfway through the sprint. So that had to be carried over and over and over and over. So individually, each team came to the conclusion that actually, for them, a 3-week sprint worked better than a 2-week sprint did. As I said, one of the teams does sort of play around with some of the rules of the team, so bring in resources to be able to meet those. But in the main, the others pretty much stick to the number of engineers, writers, and the times. So that seems to work very well. Right. As I mentioned, especially last year, I heard a lot of comments about writing a sprint after your development team. Yes, I suppose you could. What happens then, though, is if the team's priorities are changed for some business reason, you're then sort of working on the wrong thing, and it can get confusing. And as for, I'm going to write in the same way I always have done whilst my team do whatever they want to do, what happens if they suddenly decide that they're going to ship this new feature that some big customer has been asking for, but you haven't got to your documentation yet, because that's the thing that you're going to do further down the line. So basically that's a quick view of how they work. What works well? as a writer, and I'm not sole writer on all of these teams. I do have another writer in southern US. Location becomes fairly irrelevant. Half of these teams are in India, some have people in America. Yeah. It works quite well globally. What we do is, as lead writer on the main project and sole writer on the other teams, very early, somewhere between the product owner creating the story and it getting to being prioritized in the backlog, I'll review all of the stories. And what I'm looking for is this customer facing? You know, quite a lot of the stuff we do is sort of very back end. The customer has no idea what we're doing. As long as it works, they don't care. If it's totally back end, I'll say, look, I'll see you in 3 weeks' time. You haven't got anything for me to do at this point. But if there is any, usually the keyword is if they say UI anywhere in, or user interface or interface anywhere in the story, that's an automatic trigger that I'm going to have to do something. So I will check through, and I will make sure that there are comments about documentation in that story. The teams are getting better. I think I've nagged them sufficiently now that they've actually started putting these in. I might as well put them in now, because otherwise he'll only have a moan at me when he sees it, kind of thing, which is progress, I suppose. The things I'm looking for is if there's documentation, or if there's UI, I will need to write docs, which means I will need to create suitable tasks. I will need to make sure that there are suitable tasks for the other teams, for the rest of the team to review the stuff I'm doing, bearing in mind we've got 3 weeks from start to finish. The great advantage, some seats around. The great advantage is everybody on the team is really focused on what's going on in that story. This is brilliant. How many times have you taken a document to review and the people that were working on the UI 3 months ago, they've totally forgotten what they were doing then. It's not their priorities. They're doing on something else. They've been through several things since then. So with Agile working in the same sprint, your priorities are the same as theirs. We need to get it finished. The done criteria include, are the docs finished? Have they been reviewed? Great. They can't complete the story unless they've reviewed my documentation. One thing that one of my teams do, and I would love to take credit for this, but I can't, it wasn't my idea. It was actually the development manager of all people's idea, so hey-ho. They decided that when we do the story demo at the end of each sprint, the meeting that says yes or no to whether this is what we wanted, we'll assemble everybody in a room, get all the teleconference running up with all the stakeholders in America and India and wherever else they might be. Then we'll open the product, the software, at the relevant page in the UI and hit the help button. Then the tech writer for that story, me usually, has to explain to the meeting what the story's all about, what the feature is, using the help. This is great on several ways. One, for a change, somebody actually listens to us in meetings. Now, isn't that a novel idea? And another thing is it means that right up to the end, you're encouraging feedback. So you've got the whole meeting, you've got the product managers, you've got the marketing people, you've got the support people, all giving a final chance for input into the docs. And then once the writer has gone through the features using the help, then the engineers talk about the stuff that is of interest to them, the hows and whys and why they did it this way and not another way, and answering the marketing questions and whether support will be able to maintain it and all that kind of stuff. So that is something that, as I said, I'd love to claim responsibility for. It wasn't, it was suggested by somebody else, but it works really, really, really well. Okay. What works less well? Well, I mentioned earlier on that I work on multiple teams. So, got a scheduling issue. We have daily 15-minute stand-ups. Hey, I'm on 5 teams, so that's potentially an hour and a quarter every day. I could be sitting just saying, yesterday I did it, and today I'm going to... Yeah, so not particularly an efficient use of my time. How I handle this is a couple of ways. If a team's got no work for me in a particular sprint, I'll be upfront to them and say, fine, doesn't look like I've got anything, do you agree? If they say yes, I say, right, okay, see you in 3 weeks. So it's why attend a meeting when you're just attending it for the sake of it. So that gives me back, my maths is never good, hour and a quarter a week. The other one is if there are lots of teams, especially when, as these things will always happen, whether you like it or not, 2 teams decide they're going to have a stand-up at 10 o'clock in the morning. I can't be in 2 places. So I'll then work effectively sort of an informal, I guess you could call it a minimum service contract or whatever with them. So I'll say, I'll attend your meeting at least twice a week. You've got more work for me. I'll make sure I'm in at least 3 meetings a week for the other team. Yeah. Then if there's anything major to report, I can either actually go around and talk to them or drop a team an email, depending on which team it is and where they're based. Okay, what else doesn't work particularly well? I've already mentioned that every team works differently. So they have different team velocities, which is a term that you get fed up. It just means how much work each team can do, and it has some sort of arbitrary number, which is meaningless to any other team. There's no comparison. You know, one team might say, "Oh, we've got a velocity of 6 story points a sprint," or another team say, "Yeah, but ours is 20." But you can't correlate them to each other. Doesn't mean one's doing nearly 4 times as much work as the other. It just means they count differently. Hey ho. What else? He says losing his point there. Right. Editing, localization. It's interesting. We have products. Most of mine are localized into 8 languages. Some of our products are localized into, was it 22-ish, 26-ish, something like that. So, you know, localization is a big issue. When we first started going agile, we sort of did a lot of work with the localization team, a lot of coordination with them, and at the end of each sprint, we would be able to say, "Oh, here are the files for," and they very quickly said, "Look, you know, the localization process is quite overhead heavy. They have to do a lot of stuff just to translate a handful of words, and on a sprint-by-sprint basis, the overhead was far in excess of the actual translation workload." So they started saying what we developed was sort of a method where early in the release cycle, I will give my best estimate on whether it's going to have, you know, loads of docs or it's not going to be too bad this time. And the documentation is made available for them to take, but the localization team can choose when they're going to actually take the drops. We're quite lucky in that respect because we have a common system. We work in DITA. We have a common CMS. Their localization tools link directly into the CMS. So I write the files. I tell them that they're ready by changing the status and an email, yeah, and then they can pick the files directly up. There's no transferring of files or anything that we used to have. So localization choose when they're going to take the drops. If they feel that there's a risk that in the final development sprint there's going to be a massive word count, they'll take a couple of earlier drops just to clear the deck so they can say, yes, well, yeah, we can handle this X thousand words at the end of the project, rather than risk having such a large word count that it's going to risk return dates and things like that. Editing, we have a company policy where all of our documentation has to go through our editors. They have a very hectic job because there's 2 editors serving 60-ish writers. Yeah, so they they have a busy workflow, but they're also pretty responsive. One of them, I don't think, sleeps and just you know, she's based West Coast USA, and you'll get emails from her from 3 a.m. her time, because I just couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd do some more work. Crazy. And then we have our resident hippie, Chris, who's great as well, who actually edits a lot of my stuff. The first few sprints, when sort of they're new to the product, is a little more problematic, but you get to the point where they understand your doc set sufficiently that you can start sending them incremental information rather than, hey, it's 500 pages, go and tell me what you think. We'll send them sort of 5, 6, 10, 20 pages with the changes on, and they have enough of the background knowledge by now that they can just work that in isolation, which reduces the timescales. We don't attempt to get the edit within the 3-week sprint cycle, but it has to be done before anything goes to localization. So we sort of, in a similar way to localization, we sort of drip feed the information as we go. What else? From some research that one of our managers has done, we understand that the sort of industry average when working in agile development environments in the software industry, blah, 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 is that you have about 1 writer to about 20 developers, QA people. So it seems reasonable. I think we're currently running around about 1 to 33, I think it is, which means we never have the chance to be bored. We don't sit there twiddling our thumbs thinking, oh, I hope the boss doesn't notice because this isn't a very healthy state to be in. But having said that, it seems to sort of balance out, because you'll have some sprints where you have loads of work to do and others where you don't. And by working on multiple teams, usually it will average out that you're sort of fairly constantly busy all the time. I mean, I don't think we have, sorry, this is one of my colleagues, Fiona. I don't think we have too much having to stay sort of to silly hours in order to get things done. It happens occasionally, but not very often. Certainly much, much better. I think we both remember the days when we have a localization drop coming up at the end of a waterfall sort of 18-month cycle, and we're still there. I think, what was the record? I seem to vaguely remember you giving in and going home at about 2 a.m. or something, and I was still there at 3:30 or something. And you're just thinking, this has got to be more, it's got to be better. And this is better. What else doesn't work? One thing I haven't yet resolved. If my boss comes to me and says, how much writing resource do your teams need next year? My answer is, haven't got a clue. I can tell you how much I need for the next 3 weeks. Got a pretty good idea of what I need for the following 3 weeks. After that, the detail just becomes fuzzier and fuzzier. So long-term planning, I don't quite know the answer to that one. I don't know if anybody else does. If anybody else has come across the same thing and has an answer, please tell me. So, what else do we got?
Don't you have a development roadmap? Or do they not adhere to it?
We do, sort of. But they are more agile in as much as, for my main product, we have a lot of customers that are sort of global banks, government departments, Ministry of Defence type organisations around the globe, and they all have a very high opinion of their own importance. So when they need a new feature, they want it next week, if you're lucky, last week preferably. So we do get an element of changing priorities. We're also going through a little bit of a product team reorganisation thing, which means that my main team is now suddenly hit a release last week before, and they're now going off to work on a different product line, which I'm not sure yet whether is going to include me or not. But I've still got other work to do, so that's not a problem. So, sort of to start wrapping up some of these ideas, again, these are my opinions, not anybody else's. Is Agile a perfect solution? No, it's got problems like any system has. Um, most of them you can work around. It has some difficulties. You have to be more flexible with your editors or your localization teams, but it sort of works. Will you come across things that don't work the way you're doing things and that you have to change? Yeah. Just think of an example of some of these. Well, I mentioned about the editing and the sort of localization quite a bit. If a customer has, a high priority feature that's being fitted in, that's particularly where you may need to become more flexible with editors, with localization, because it sort of shortens the expected delivery. So, it might be that we're planning to release this in 3 months' time, but all of a sudden we might actually be doing a small sort of stage sort of patch to a particular customer sort of halfway through that, but they still may need, we still need to go through the processes. Processes, that's the next one. If any of you remember my talk last year, McAfee, we started from really disparate. There were 2 main writing teams, and we occasionally spoke to each other. And we didn't know at the time, but there were a couple of other writers that had been sort of acquired as part of various acquisitions. They didn't know we existed, we didn't know they existed. They used Word, they used AuthorIt, they used this, that, PageMaker, FrameMaker, Notepad, you name it, tablets, stones and chisels, all sorts of things. We had no real process. Each team, we had our processes. We had quite a few arguments with the team in the States about how their processes won't work for us and they wouldn't accept anything we thought, blah, blah, blah. Then along the way, we actually became this whole global team of, I think we mentioned somewhere around about 60 people now, including managers, editors, and writers, and some tools specialists now. So we have 3 sort of CMS admin people to help us with sort of structural issues in DITA and that kind of stuff. We also got a lot more process as we became this single team. We had it was actually a very large acquisition that brought in a well-structured documentation team, and we sort of followed their structure, their processes. But the processes didn't align with Agile. So a group of us have spent some time sort of going through all of our processes and procedures and working out the bits that don't really work in Agile and coming up with suggestions for their improvement. And that's sort of just getting to the final stage at the moment. I think we're currently at well, everybody please review these to make sure they work in your particular circumstances kind of stage before it's thou shalt, which will be probably in a month or 2. So, yeah, that's good. Is it a perfect solution? No. Would I go back to doing waterfall if I had the choice? No. I like, maybe I've got a head a bit like a squirrel. My focus tends to, look, a little bit. So having short amounts of work suits me really well because I can focus on it, and 3 weeks isn't too bad when you think about it. I can keep my focus for 3 weeks on this particular thing. When you're on a sort of waterfall, yes, everything's slipping. It's now gone from a year up to sort of 14, 16, 18 months. It, for me, was quite hard to keep focus on these things. It becomes same old, whereas this offers a bit of element of change. Big advantage to me is I have people that actually want to review my docs. Well, okay, maybe that's slightly an exaggeration, but they have a reason to review my docs. The reason is they can't say, hey, we've done this, until my stuff's done as well. So it's sort of a very good focus for them. As I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy the leading the demo with the documentation. I think that's a brilliant idea. Feel free, as I said, I'd like to claim that it was my idea, but it's not. So feel free, if it works for your teams, then great. So I think that, surprisingly less time than I was expecting. Yeah, yeah, I think the next one is, does anybody have any questions? The short answer is yes. Right, it depends. There are some elements we have sort of some, I guess, informal processes within some of the teams that they can, if they discover something after the close point, then it becomes a bug. So that's not quite the circumstance you were saying, but it's sort of similar. So, yeah, just because the task has finished doesn't mean it's perfect. If it's good enough, then we'll put a bug in against it. If obviously it's something fairly major, like I've documented a totally different workflow to the one that they expected. Yeah. Yes, I have had a similar circumstance. One of my teams that is sort of ramping up, it's... how can I explain this quickly? We're a internet security company. We have lots of different products that, at the end of the day, do fairly similar things, but it might be, my main product is an email gateway for large corporations. We have other products that work for setting your corporate web usage policies. We have the antivirus stuff. But under the hood, a lot of these all have similar features. You need to create a policy to define your corporate strategy for email, for web. And up until now, that's always been, each different product team has gone off and they've designed what they think it should be. So we have very different pieces of UI that do very similar things across products. So somebody came up with a brilliant idea. Why don't we have common UI components so that I need to create a policy. Let's have this chunk that we can put into the email, into the data loss prevention, into the web. So it's a new product. It's not an end user product as such. It's modules that other products will be able to use. And from that point, the documentation is not going to be an output, as we know. I think you probably picked up that we use DITA. My output is going to be a map that another writer on the end product will be able to pick up and drop into their documentation. So they don't have to explain the tasks behind setting a policy. They can create something around it that explains the detail for their specific circumstances. Anyway, very long-winded answer here, I know. Where I was coming from this was the team started, they've been running for quite a long time, developing the back end, the architecture behind these. I've come fairly late to the party, but they're actually developing chunks of UI now, so I have to start doing the documentation. And there were lots of tasks that were, often they were documenting tasks, silly things like, how do I add a new rule to this page? But I couldn't work that in isolation. I had nothing to hang it off. I had no framework. So we had a few problems with not being able to complete stories because the documentation wasn't done. Which is getting relevant after all. So what we did is we sat down and had a sort of chat with the team, and they said, well, when we first started, we each had little separate standalone stories to create the architecture or to create the framework for the sort of web interactions or whatever. So why don't you do the same? So I did. I created a story to create the documentation framework, which is currently, hopefully, being nicely reviewed whilst I'm here. And then next week, I should be able to close that, and I now have a framework which I can use to hang off other things. perhaps it's slightly artificial and it's not very agile, but it sort of seemed to be the best solution. It's usually, if you do have that kind of problem, it's a case of go and talk to people. That's the key thing with Agile, is you have that ability because you've only got a small number of people. It's not like you have to present to a whole development team or whatever. You go, a couple of QA engineers, so that side makes it a little easier. Sometimes, well, yeah. To a certain extent, I've done both. I try not to. It's sort of very much if I have to, I will, but if I can get away without it, it's best not to, because it just helps with the team cohesion. It just starts, it stops any friction there, but if needs be, needs be. Okay? Any? No. We tend to use PDF, or I tend to use PDF. Yeah, well, there's typically, with the exception of the new sort of modular component team that I just mentioned, everything else, my deliverables include a PDF, product guide, and also online help. It's single source. That's what they get at the end of it. So during the sprint, I will. It's not that bad, honest. Yeah, during the sprint, I will check in sort of at regular points the updated help as it's going, so it can be tested sort of contextually within the interface. But as an HTML help file is not easy to review. You can't exactly scribble on the screen to return comments or whatever. So the teams I work with, they're in the same building mainly, but there are a few other people. So creating a PDF of just the specific changes, I find works best for me. And actually, even our editor prefers to work from a PDF, so that's his choice. He has access to the individual topics, but his preference is to sort of read it as a book. So, okay.
When you do those presentations of the sprints of the help, what are you actually presenting?
Right. Okay. Basically, what I do is I give an overview of the story using the help as the evidence. So, this story is about adding feature X, Y, Z into this, so that, and then I'll go through the use case. As a system administrator, I would like to be able to configure my email system so that, he says, making it up as he goes along, so that I can easily check every one of my users that received an email that included this particular attachment. That's the user. That's the use case. Something I didn't mention, and perhaps is important, when that information is available within the story, and one of my nags is, if it's not, please can you say what the use case for this story is in the first place? I will take that use case and use it as an example within my documentation. So if it's a brand new feature, I'll have exciting title or not. Some contextual information, and that contextual information will include why you would want to use this. What's the benefit to you? Hey, if you use this feature, you can identify, your systems have told you that this particular attachment is malware. You can now go and look at everybody within your organization that has received this same attachment, so you know which computers potentially have malware on them. That kind of thing, or somebody's sending confidential information out of the corporation, or whatever the story is. So that information is in there. We reflect that within the documentation. We also use that as an example to detect XYZ attachment, do this, this, and this. So it's tying the story, the documentation, and the process all together at one point. Did that help at all, or did I just ramble too much? Okay, so is that?
We need to wrap up because,
Okay, fair enough.
I'm sure you know the drill by now. Don't forget the survey monkey. And thank you, Andrew, for a very interesting and useful
Okay.
session. And I'm sure Andrew will be hanging around for
Yeah, I'll be, as they say, I'm here all day. Well, until about 5:30 when I've got to go to the station. But apart from that,
And please give a big hand.
thank you very much.